The golden glow of chandeliers filled the five-star restaurant, casting light across polished tables, fine silverware, and glasses that sparkled like crystal. It was a place where the wealthy came to flaunt their status, where elegance and refinement were supposed to rule. But for the staff who worked there, there was one shadow that loomed larger than all the glittering lights. His name was whispered with dread long before he stepped through the door, the rich and unbearable man. Every time he entered, the air seemed to change. Conversations at nearby tables grew quiet, waiters exchanged nervous glances, and even the chef in the kitchen braced for the storm. He wasn't just wealthy, he was cruel. He snapped his fingers to summon waiters, like servants sent dishes back for the smallest reasons, and unleashed insults as if they were part of the menu. He had money, and he believed it gave him the right to humiliate anyone who crossed his path. The staff dreaded the nights he came. Some waiters would suddenly find excuses to disappear into the kitchen, others would beg their colleagues to cover his table. Many had been reduced to tears by his words. He thrived on their fear, wearing his arrogance like a crown, convinced he ruled over every corner of the room. To him, this restaurant was his stage, and the staff were props in his performance of superiority. And on this particular evening, as the heavy glass doors opened and his figure appeared, the nightmare began once again. Chairs scraped softly as guests shifted uncomfortably, waiters froze in place, and a quiet sigh spread through the staff. The unbearable man had returned, and with him the storm everyone wanted to avoid. That same evening, as tension rippled quietly through the restaurant, a new face stepped onto the floor. She was young, confident, and carried herself with a calm poise that immediately set her apart. Her name was Maya, the newest hire on the staff. For her, it was the first official night on duty. While the others whispered warnings about the unbearable man seated at his usual table, she simply adjusted her apron, tucked her notepad into her pocket, and listened. "Stay away from him," one waiter whispered urgently. "He'll tear you apart," another added. "He's made people quit on the spot. Don't even look in his direction." But Maya only smiled gently. She wasn't naive, she could feel the fear in their voices, but there was a quiet strength in her demeanor, a strength that suggested she wasn't easily shaken. Across the room, the rich man leaned back in his chair, snapping his fingers sharply at a passing server, who immediately turned away, pretending not to hear. He scowled, muttering under his breath about incompetence. Plates on his table sat untouched, glasses clinked as he tapped them impatiently, and the restaurant seemed to shrink under his presence. But Maya didn't shrink. She watched, studied, and then with steady footsteps made her way toward his table. Each step drew the eyes of her co-workers, some holding their breath, others shaking their heads in disbelief. No one dared approach him, yet here she was walking straight into the storm. She stopped by his table, her voice clear but calm. "Good evening, sir. I'll be your server tonight. How may I assist you?" The room fell silent, every waiter frozen in place, waiting for the inevitable clash. For the first time in a long time, someone had chosen to face the rich and unbearable man head-on. The man's face reddened, his arrogance clashing against the wall of calm strength in front of him. He wasn't used to this. Waiters usually crumbled, begged for forgiveness, or scurried away. But Maya stood tall, her presence unshaken, her voice unwavering. The restaurant held its breath, waiting for the explosion. "You must not know who I am," he growled, his words dripping with menace. "People like you don't speak to me this way. I could buy and sell this entire place before my dessert arrives." His threat hung heavy in the air, but Maya's eyes never wavered. "Maybe you could," she replied, her tone steady, "but money doesn't buy character. It doesn't buy respect. And it certainly doesn't give you the right to tear people down." Her words were simple, yet they struck with precision. The diners nearby shifted forward in their seats, watching intently. The waiters who had once fled the table now peeked cautiously from the kitchen doorway. For the first time, someone had said aloud what everyone else had only dared to think. The man opened his mouth, ready to unleash another tirade, but nothing came out. He searched for words, but her calm defiance had pierced through the armor of his ego. For once, he was the one left speechless. And in that moment, the atmosphere of the restaurant changed. The fear that had once filled the room began to lift, replaced by a quiet admiration. The unbearable man, once the ruler of the restaurant, had finally met his match. The balance of power had shifted, and it all began with a single voice that refused to be silenced. For the first time in memory, the rich man sat frozen in his chair, his hand hovering over the glass of wine he had been swirling moments before. The sharpness in his eyes dulled, as Maya's words echoed in his mind, "Money doesn't buy character, it doesn't buy respect." His lips parted, but no insult came forth, no angry command to put the waitress in her place. Instead, there was only silence, thick and unfamiliar. Around the room, the diners watched with wide eyes, stunned by the shift they were witnessing. Some leaned closer to one another, whispering in disbelief. Waiters, who had hidden themselves in fear, now emerged from behind the counters and doorways, their faces lighting with something they hadn't felt in a long time: relief. The unbearable man's reign of intimidation had been broken, not by force, but by truth. Maya stood steady, her hands calmly folded in front of her, as if the silence was expected. She didn't press him, didn't gloat, didn't push for more. Her strength was in her restraint, her ability to let the weight of her words do the work. And that weight was crushing him. The man glanced around the restaurant and noticed the change. The staff wasn't trembling anymore, the diners weren't avoiding his gaze, they were watching him, waiting. For once, he was the one under scrutiny. His wealth, his arrogance, his pride, all of it seemed so small under the unflinching presence of the young black woman who refused to bow. And so he sat there, quiet and still, the restaurant bathed in a silence that spoke louder than any insult he had ever thrown. The man who once thrived on making others feel small was for the first time dwarfed by his own silence. The silence in the restaurant didn't last long. A single pair of hands began to clap from one of the corner tables. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the quiet room erupted into applause, a wave of sound rising and filling the air. Diners who had once kept their heads down now smiled proudly, their eyes fixed on Maya. Some even stood to their feet, cheering softly, as if relieved to see justice play out before them. The staff too felt the change. Waiters who had been paralyzed by fear now exchanged glances of admiration. A few of them nodded at Maya, gratitude etched on their faces. For so long, they had endured his arrogance in silence, but she had broken the cycle with nothing more than courage and truth. The rich man, still seated at his table, shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the crowd's reaction. For once, the attention wasn't his to command. The applause wasn't for him. It was for the woman who had stood where no one else dared to stand. And in that moment, the power in the room belonged to Maya. As the applause slowly faded, the rich man sat still, staring at the table before him. For years, he had lived in a world where his wealth commanded respect, where people bowed to his arrogance because they feared what he could take from them. But now, in the eyes of strangers and staff alike, he wasn't a man to be feared, he was a man exposed. Her words replayed in his mind like a haunting echo. Money doesn't buy character. It doesn't buy respect. He had built his entire life on the illusion that it did. Yet here in this small restaurant, that illusion had shattered. For the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar: shame. He glanced around the room and saw no admiration, no obedience, no fear. Only disappointment mixed with a newfound respect for the woman who had stood against him. In her strength he saw everything he lacked. And deep inside, though his pride resisted, he began to wonder if perhaps it was time to change. The restaurant slowly returned to life, but the memory of that moment lingered in every corner. Maya didn't just confront a wealthy man, she confronted the idea that power and money gave someone the right to belittle others. Her courage reminded everyone that respect cannot be bought and dignity cannot be taken away. The rich man's silence spoke louder than any insult he had ever hurled. For once, he wasn't the one in control, and in that silence, the world saw the truth that arrogance crumbles when faced with integrity. Maya's stand wasn't just for herself, but for every worker, every waiter, every voice that had gone unheard under the weight of entitlement. As the doors of the restaurant closed that night, the lesson remained: true strength isn't in wealth or status, but in the ability to stand firm, speak truth, and demand respect, not just for yourself but for everyone. And sometimes all it takes is one brave voice to change the entire room.